Dr. Ghazvinian, the floor is yours, and we're so much honored to have you tonight.
Thank you very much for that very warm and kind introduction, and very much too generous of you. And thank you for inviting me this evening. Thank you to the co-sponsors and everybody down there in North Carolina. I'm just sorry, genuinely sorry that I can't be there with you in person. North Carolina, it's actually one of the few places in the US I've really never spent a lot of time. So I really would have loved the opportunity to come and see you, but inshallah, that'll have to happen another time.
Inshallah, we'd love to have you anytime.
But thank you. I will be giving my remarks today in English, but as Dr. Ghazvinian mentioned, yes, I left Iran I was born in 1974. We left in 1975 when I was 1 year old. And I grew up in the UK and then later in Los Angeles. And the first time I ever went to Iran was in 2007 in my 30s. So I apologize that my Farsi is not as good as it should be, but I will just say همونطوری که آقای دکتر امامیان مطرح کردن من سخنرانی امشب در زبان انگلیسی میدم، اما کسی اگر خواست سوال جواب به فارسی زبان فارسی بکنه تا اونجایی که میتونم پاسخم به فارسی هم میدم یا به پاسخ به انگلیسی میدم. So please do feel comfortable if you like to ask your questions in Persian if you prefer at the end, if you're just more comfortable with that. I will understand you even if I might respond in English, just for the sake of everyone. So the history of United States relations with Iran obviously is one of those topics that people have a lot of strong feelings about, and everybody has an opinion about. When I say everybody, I mean everybody Iranian, maybe not everybody American, but certainly it's something that I think people have at least some awareness of, even in the US. If you know absolutely nothing about the US and Iran and the relationship between the US and Iran, you know that the one thing you know is that it is not a very good relationship. As a historian of that relationship, the first question anybody is going to ask me is, why? Tell us what happened. Tell us why things got to be so bad. That's a very natural question to ask. I understand why you might ask that question. Maybe many of you come here tonight because you want to know the answer to that. Like, okay, well, explain to us, how did it get so bad? That's fine. It's a very fair and reasonable question, but I think I want to get us away from that a little bit if I can, because I think that embedded in that question are a couple of other implications and questions which I think are not helpful. One of them is, I think that question implies, whose fault is it, right? Who do we blame? Again, I understand that impulse, but as historians, our job is not to find who is to blame, but rather to explain processes and explain how we got to where we are, right? I believe, and maybe I'm very innocent, some people say I'm too naive, but I believe genuinely that the United States and Iran do not have a bad relationship because one country or the other is somehow inherently evil, or one government or the other is somehow inherently evil. I know people might disagree with that, but I think that things have happened for certain reasons, historical reasons and processes, and I think it's important to kind of understand that. And that doesn't mean that you suddenly like one government or the other. It just means you understand how we got here. That's it. But I think the other problem with that question of, how did we get here, is that it treats history as, as almost like a courtroom, where somebody has to be right, somebody has to be wrong. It also means that you are looking for the problems. You're already starting with the negativity. I say in the preface to my book, this is one of the few histories, a few relationships between two countries that always begins at the end. Why do we begin this when the relationship is broken off, when the problems begin? Why don't we begin it at the beginning? If your question is, how did things get so bad? Maybe we could also ask that question. I think you're also suggesting to me that there was a time when things weren't so bad. I think that's the implication, right? That there was some sort of golden age when everything was fine, everything was great, presumably. But when I think Iranians and Americans, or people who are interested, let's say, in this topic, are very quick to point out where things went wrong. But then when you start to talk about, well, what are things, what is this golden age that you have in mind? People don't always have a strong feeling. And you bring in, a few other things. One is that, okay, if you are looking only for the negativity and the hostility between the two countries, you forget that for the overwhelming majority of this history, these two countries had very warm and positive relations. It's easy to forget now, because you look at the last 40 years, but I'm looking at a 200, 300-year stretch of time. And for the overwhelming majority of that time, this is a relationship of incredible mutual interest, mutual fascination, mutual admiration, even a kind of mutual idealization. And that to me is just as interesting as the hostility. So for all of these reasons, I think it's a shame to begin our questions, our stories with, where do things go wrong? What's the problem? Whose fault is it? But even if you want to do that, let's humor that for a moment. There are, generally speaking, two places where people begin, right? And I think it depends on the baggage that you're bringing to this yourself. I would say, broadly speaking, if you are the kind of person who is inclined to be supportive of the United States, generally speaking, believe in America, believe in the promise of American foreign policy, believe that America is a basically benevolent country that means well, and are very, very critical of Iran and the Islamic Republic. Generally speaking, you begin this story in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. And you say, oh, everything was fine until the students overran the embassy and took hostages for over a year, and that was a blatantly illegal act, and there was this, anti-American revolution. Okay, all right, that's fine. If you are, generally speaking, critical of United States and American foreign policy, or more likely to be kind of protective or defensive of Iran or the Islamic Republic, you are more likely to say the story began in 1953, when the CIA participated very heavily in the overthrow of very popular Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh for nationalizing the Iranian oil company. Overthrew this government, helped to cement the Shah's rule, which eventually became more dictatorial and then led to the revolution. You say, well, that's where the problem begins. And again, there's this implication that everything was fine until the United States came and overthrew the Iranian government. Okay. That's also a perfectly reasonable position. But the question I have, regardless of where you want to begin the story, is, well, okay, what do you mean when you say everything was fine until? For those who say everything was fine until the 1979 revolution, well, was it really? I mean, yes, Iran had a very pro-American government. There's a very friendly relationship between Washington and Tehran, but was everything really fine? No. I mean, I think those of you who have either lived that history or know this history, and that's most of you, I think, probably to some degree or another, know that everything was not great. There was a close strategic Cold War alliance, but there was a lot of deep endemic problems that were being ignored in all of this. Similarly, if you are saying, oh, everything was fine until 1953, okay, well, then my question to you is, describe for me what this golden age looked like. What did US-Iran relations look like before 1953? I know a lot of people, including, my own father and his generation, that feel very strongly that the problem began in 1953. Okay, but when you push people a little bit, well, what did this look like? Well, most people don't know that much about US-Iran relations before 1953. People may know a few things here and there, but was this a golden age? I think you could argue that there was a golden age, maybe, of US-Iran relations in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Yeah, but it wasn't perfect, and again, I think we don't always understand a lot about it. So that was what I was curious about. and that's when I started to think, let's get beyond these kind of antagonistic narratives and actually look at the deeper history, the longer history. And then the question for a historian becomes, well, where do you begin? And this is something that all historians struggle with, is like, where do they start their story? Because, you could start in, Neolithic times if you want to, but you have to start somewhere. So, well, you could start in 79 or 53, but I think that doesn't work very well for the reasons that I just articulated. You could start, like a lot of American historians do, in around 1940. Why then? Because before Pearl Harbor, before 1942, the United States is a very, very isolationist power. It simply does not care about Iran or the Middle East. When I say it, I'm talking about official Washington. Just doesn't care about these parts of the world where the US has no strategic interests, no entangling alliances, etc. So there's a tendency among American historians, in the 1940s, you start to get these first advisory missions. You got the Norman Schwarzkopf gendarmerie mission, you got the Armish-Mag military advisory mission, and then you get the Arthur Millspore financial advisory mission, and so on, Treasury. So people are sometimes aware of these. This is where you have the first large-scale American investment in bilateral relations with Iran. So it makes sense. Before that, there's no real. Iran might as well have been Antarctica for the State Department, for official Washington. They didn't care. So you can see why some people begin their story in 1940. Okay, well, there's a problem with that, and it's a big problem from my perspective, because what you're saying is that basically when you do that, you're saying that US-Iran relations only becomes important when the United States starts to pay attention. Well, guess what I discovered when I went and spent a lot of time with the Iranian archives is that one Iranian government after another, from the 1850s until the 1940s, for 80, 90 years, was very interested in the United States, very interested in developing the US as a so-called third force to counterbalance the pressures from the British Empire in the Persian Gulf and from the Russian Empire in the north, beginning with Amir Kabir in the 1850s. The first one to really articulate this idea of a third force foreign policy. And it wasn't just the US, they looked at Germany and other powers, but the US was always there. They always really wanted to cultivate better relations with the US. That is an interesting part of the story. And you completely wipe that out. You erase that Iranian side of the story when you begin in 1940, when you begin just with the US and the US priorities. You lose so many interesting details, like, for example, the fact that the very first I love this, the very first disagreement the US and Iran ever had was in the 1850s, when they were negotiating their first treaty of friendship. In 1851, they signed it. It took 5 years before it was signed and ratified. In 1856, eventually ratified by the US Senate in 1857. It took longer to negotiate that treaty than it took to negotiate the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. You're like, why? What the hell are Iran and the US arguing about in the 1850s? Well, guess what? There were a lot of things, but actually one of the really interesting sticking points, or the big sticking point, was that because Iran really wanted to develop the US as a counterbalance to Britain and Russia, the Iranian government wanted to buy warships from the US Navy, flying the Stars and Stripes, manned with American sailors under the umbrella of the Persian Navy, to send a message to the British, to the Royal Navy in the Persian Gulf. The United States, understandably, said, "We don't want any part of this. Thank you very much. No, we can't get involved in this kind of stuff. We're not, we don't want to get sucked into your business." That's the first disagreement the US and Iran ever had. Iran saying, "We want you more involved in our affairs," and the US saying, "No, we don't want to interfere in your business." That's incredible to me, right? That's what we miss when we don't go back far enough in history. Understanding how we got from there to here is more interesting to me than just finding out whose fault it is, right? So yeah, I could have started in the 1850s, but you know what? There's another problem with that, which is that when you do that, you are privileging a state-to-state relationship, diplomacy, and kind of high politics. And relations between countries, I believe, are not just about relationships between governments. the American people and the Iranian people were interacting with each other long before 1850s. As early as the 1830s, when you had the first Presbyterian missionaries going from New England and the northeastern states of the US to Iran to build schools and clinics, and yes, also proselytize and convert people to Presbyterian Christianity. It's a fascinating part of the story. They weren't actually trying to convert Muslims, they were trying to convert Iranian Christians to what they considered a better form of Christianity. They would be working mostly with the Assyrians, with the Ashuri population in Urumiyeh and Tabriz and Hamadan and places like that in northwest Iran, and eventually Tehran as well. That was the first really large-scale people-to-people contact. That begins in the 1830s. So I could begin with that, okay. But I wanted to do something a little bit more eccentric, which is to start with prehistory. Because in any relationship, you also have preconceived notions that the two people or two entities have of each other before they even come into contact. What did, and this to me was an interesting question, what did Iranians think of America, Yengi Donya, New, whatever you want to call it, North America, before the 1830s? And what did Americans, or even colonial North Americans before the United States even exists, think of Iran, or Persia, as they would have called it? I was curious, what is the mental baggage they bring to this? I thought maybe I wouldn't find anything, but I actually found some really cool stuff. And this blew my mind more than anything else, I think. The very first American newspaper, the very first newspapers published in North America, in colonial Philadelphia and Boston especially, in the 1720s, before the US exists as a country, were obsessed with Iran. And I didn't expect that. I don't think anyone would expect that. I came across newspapers published where 20–30% of the newspaper is all about Iran. I came across a newspaper from 1724 published right here in Philadelphia, where the headline, the lead story was, "We regret that we have no news from Persia this week." In Philadelphia in the 1720s, the fact that there was no news from Iran was the lead story. I'm like, whoa, okay, why? Okay, why would that be the case? Well, so there's one very pragmatic reason, which is it just happened to be coincidence that when they first started publishing newspapers in America, and there had been some newspapers before 1720, but very, very little. They're just sporadic. The serious newspaper publishing started around 1719, 1720. The big news story, international news story in 1722 was, and maybe some of you may not know this history that well, it's really going back to you. But the big international news story of that day was the Afghan rebellion in Kandahar that brought down the collapse of the Safavid Empire. This was the rebellion led by Mahmud Hotaki and the Afghans in Kandahar, who were rebelling because they were being forced to convert from Sunni to Shia Islam by the Persian Empire. It was part of the Persian Empire. And they went all the way to Isfahan, to the capital, and they brought down the collapse of the Safavid Empire, and it was this huge siege, and it went on for many months. It was gruesome, it was miserable, and it brought an end to this glorious empire that was famous throughout the world at the time, right? That Shakespeare had written about in his plays, right? Just 100 years earlier, and it was well known to colonial North America. Okay, that was the big news story. But why would they be so interested in it? Why were they so obsessed with it? Well, guess what? So a couple of reasons, but before I even get to that, the one thing that I think is super interesting, they weren't just really fascinated by this, but they were very strongly and uniformly and vocally pro-Iranian, the American media of the 1720s. You look at the coverage and they talk about the Afghans as the usurpers and the evil Afghans, bringing down the Shah and his government, and the Iranians are painted as the victims in this kind of civilized, glorious kind of empire that's being destroyed by these barbarians from the east. That's the way they describe it, very strongly, very, very strongly, and very sensationalistically. so why? Why are they so obsessed with Iran, and why are they so pro-Iranian in the 1720s? Well, a couple of reasons. One is religious. In New England, the northeastern states of the, it's not states, I should say, colonies at the time are largely Calvinist, Puritan. They take a very literal reading of the Bible. They didn't know anything about the Middle East, but what they did know, they had read from the Bible. And how does Iran look in the Bible? Actually, pretty good. Iran doesn't make it into the Bible that much, but when it does, it's pretty positive. Of course, we all know about Cyrus Kurosh, who liberated the Jews from the Babylonian captivity in Ezra, book 1. The three wise men, the Magi, the wise men from the East. Magi, right? When you see these nativity scenes, right? What are Magi? Magi is plural of Magus. What is Magus? Magus is Mog. Okay, it's a Zoroastrian priest. The three wise men from the East were probably Iranians, right? This is the way that that Persia looks in the Bible. But it's not just about religion, because if you're living in Philadelphia or Boston in the 1720s, you do have the one thing you know about the Middle East, and I use the term Middle East anachronistically because they wouldn't have called it the Middle East then. Okay, but the one thing you know about the East or the Orient is the Ottoman Empire, right? The evil empire of its day. You may remember the history of the Crusades. We're going back centuries now of Christian enmity with the Ottomans, and before that with the Seljuks, right? So the Turks, and you see this all the time in the European literature of the 17th and 18th century, the terrible Turk, the evil Turk, the barbarous Turk, right? It's all negative, negative, negative. But then you read Shakespeare, and it's all, there's a lot of that. But the Persians are presented very positively, right? You look at whether it's Shakespeare or travel writing from England in the 17th century. It's the great Sophie, the grand Sophie, and by Sophie they mean Safavi, right? Persia or Iran was this kind of like glorious, idyllic fantasy land somewhere to the east of the Ottoman Empire, and it was the old thing of my enemy, and my enemy is my friend, right? Remember that in 1683, the Ottoman Empire had come to the gates of Vienna, right? So there is if you're in 1723, that's only 40 years later. Think of it this way. The Ottoman siege of Vienna was as far away in people's memories in the 1720s as the Iranian Revolution is to our memories today. 40 years, okay? It's not that far. It's within living memory. And if you're a white colonial settler in North America, you think of yourself as a Christian European. So you think of the Ottomans as this great threat to all of Western civilization, to all of Christendom and Christianity and everything. And you have the history of the Crusades and all that. But you also know that the Ottomans and the Persians have a rivalry. So why am I talking about this? Because when the Afghan rebellion broke out in 1722, there was this assumption, incorrect by the way, but an assumption that the Ottomans, because the Ottomans were Sunni and the Afghans were Sunni, that they must have been secretly colluding with each other to bring down the Shia Persian Empire. Were they? No, that's just factually incorrect, but it didn't matter. To me, it reminds me, people don't like it when I make this analogy, but I don't care. It reminds me of the way these days, everything is Russia's fault. Everything is Putin's fault. It doesn't matter what it is. Somebody loses an election, it must be Putin. It couldn't be because they had a shitty election, a campaign. They don't know how to win a campaign against a really crappy candidate. No, it couldn't be that. No, they must be that, Trump is a Russian agent, whatever. Look, I don't want to get into, because I know people feel very strongly about these things, but it's this, it was this obsession with like, oh, the evil Ottomans must be behind this. The Ottomans had nothing to do with the Afghan rebellion in Kandahar. But, oh, this was the simplistic media narrative. I mean, in some ways, nothing has changed. Simplistic media narrative about the Middle East, which is that, oh, these guys are colluding against the beautiful, glorious, idyllic Persian Empire that we love so much, that is no threat to us. That, liberated the Jews from Babylonian captivity or whatever it might be, And then you start to realize, wow, this is a real mental kind of baggage that people, you look at some of the newspapers, and I was so interested in seeing this. Sometimes, they're actually explaining to American readers in the 1720s the difference between Shia and Sunni. Not very well. They said that the Shia worship Ali instead of worshiping Muhammad. Okay, and we know that Muslims don't actually worship either Ali or Muhammad, but whatever, it's, they're trying to kind of explain the difference between Shia and Sunni. One newspaper I came across described this as a conflict. The conflict between Turks and Persians was a holy war between Muslims and Persians, which to me I thought was a really interesting formulation, right? It's like this is a conflict between Muslims and Persians, as if somehow Persians are not Muslim, right? They they were aware of the fact that the Shia were a very small minority at the time and were seen as somehow unorthodox and heretical and less Muslim by the mainstream Sunni. And they liked that. Here's an empire that is less Muslim somehow, less evil, more of a fantasy kind of kingdom off to the east. Now, why am I going on and on about this? Because this is 100 years before any American comes into contact with any Iranian, as far as I know. But fast forward to the 1830s, the very, very first American Presbyterian missionary who arrives in Iran, Justin Perkins. What is he? You look at his diaries, his memoirs. What does he say? He talks about how unpleasant it is to cross through the Ottoman Empire, over the mountains, over the Zagros Mountains, and then he comes onto the Urumiyeh plain, and he described, the word he uses, he describes it as Edenic. Edenic, like the Garden of Eden, like paradise. This was the mentality. And they also believed that the other thing about the Bible is they believed, because the Ottomans were in possession of the Holy Land, right? They were in possession of all of the holy sites in Jerusalem and all that kind of stuff, which is very important to Christians. But they also believed that literally all of the biblical sites were in Mesopotamia and the Near East and Levant and whatever, and it was all occupied by the Ottomans. And by pure cosmic coincidence, just to the east of all of that was this country, this land where there were no biblical sites, that was not soiling and ruining the Bible for them. They believed that literally the Garden of Eden was somewhere around Mosul. And so Iran was quite literally east of Eden. And I call the opening chapter in my book East of Eden, because that's the way they looked at it, this kind of idea. Now, why is this important? Again, as I say, 100 years later, you get the first American, this is the mental baggage that they bring. But it's not just that. I mean, you could go, and I saw this again and again and again in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, as late as the 1970s. If anyone's ever seen, I mean, if you remember the way that Iran was portrayed in the United States in the 1970s, or you've seen it, right? If you were an American in the 1970s and you think about the Middle East, what is your impression of the Middle East? You think about the Arab world, okay, not the Ottoman Empire anymore, but what's replaced it, which is the Arab world. And you think of, the Arab oil embargo, the wars with Israel, the kind of socialist governments, Nasser, all these things that you don't like. But just to the east of that, again, just to the east of Eden, is this pro-American kingdom led by this Shah who has this very glamorous, beautiful wife, and wears these crown jewels and has this Persepolis celebration in 1971, and it's it all just seems so idyllic and wonderful. I think that there is a continuity there. I don't want to oversimplify, but there's a continuity there of constantly idealizing Iran a little bit. And that's what is lost in 1979. Now, very, very, very briefly, because I do want to take your questions. Is there an Iranian version of this? Is there a sort of West of Eden? Yes, but it looks different, and it comes at a different time. It comes later. It comes in the 1850s, in the 1860s, when Iran has a new generation of young reformists. Before then, the Iranians are not paying much attention to the US. They don't know much about it. Yengi Donya, they just think it's this savage land of cannibals and whatever, But by the 1860s, they see that this is a country that they know has had a revolution against the British Empire. They know it's a country that doesn't interfere in Iran's affairs, and they like that. The only thing they know of Americans is that these American Presbyterian missionaries who have been building schools and clinics in Urumia, for example. So when they look at there's an awareness by the mid-19th century, the 1860s, let's say, in Iran, there's an awareness that Iran is a declining power and that the West, Europe, is advancing, progressing economically, militarily, politically, in a lot of ways, and Iran is declining. And there's an awareness that, okay, we have to learn from Europe, but what they don't like about Europe is this kind of greedy, imperialistic mindset that the British have, the French have, the Belgians have, the Russians. But when they look at the US, they see, and I know this is a bit strange for us today, but at the time they see the US as basically a European country. But they see it as a European country that is just further west than the rest of Europe. And doesn't seem to have this, has all the good things that they like about Europe, all the advancement and the progress and the prosperity, but not that imperialistic mindset. They see the US as a country that had a revolution against the British Empire and that doesn't interfere in other countries' affairs. They see that there are Americans living in Iran and there is still no American embassy. There is no ministry, as they would have called it at the time. There's no American embassy until 1883. This is when the first time US sends a diplomat to Iran. That's unusual. None of the other European countries work like this. If they have missionaries or any kind of interest in Iran, they have an embassy to protect their interests and to actually not just protect their interests, but actually literally interfere in the affairs of the Iranian government. But the US isn't doing this. And so the US becomes this idealized power. It becomes a nicer version of the West, just like Iran is like a nicer version of the East for Americans. And that, I would argue, also remains right up until, not 1979, but in this case, but up until 1953. You see this again and again. You see it when Morgan Schuster comes to Iran and reorganizes, and becomes a big supporter of the Iranian constitutional revolution of the Mashruteh. You see it, I'm always amazed, as late as I think it's the summer of 1950 or 51, 52, one of those, in the midst of all of the oil nationalization crisis, when communists and nationalists and whatever, everybody's like fighting in the streets of Tehran. The word arrives in Tehran that Samuel Jordan has died. Jordan, as you know, the street Jordan in Iran must have been. Tehran comes to a standstill for his funeral, for not even a funeral, the memorials, right? As this is just 2 years before the overthrow of Mossadegh. This is what is lost, right? This really idealized vision of the US. I was very interested when I read some of the pro-Mossadegh newspapers of the early 50s, Bakhtar Emruz, which is a nationalistic, the newspaper that was closest to the Mossadegh, to the Jabhat Milli. When you look at, when they criticize Britain, Britain is evil, imperialistic, whatever. When they criticize the US, they say things like, you know, the US is naive. Maybe it's being misled by Britain, right? Right? Always, right? Maybe, you know, they don't know yet. They haven't had enough experience. You know, it's so interesting. You know, just 1 year, 2 years before the US actually overthrows the Iranian government, there is still this belief that the US is innocent, that it's not imperialistic, that Britain is like that, Russia is like that, but not the US. They're different. 3 weeks before he is overthrown, Mossadegh, when he's not getting money from the, when he applies for an emergency loan of $45 million from the US government because Iran is under sanctions from the British. He sends a letter to Eisenhower 3 weeks before the coup d'etat. Because even 3 weeks before the CIA overthrows his government, Mossadegh believes that the one country that will understand and be most sympathetic to his situation is the United States. Not even knowing that at the very moment he's writing a letter to Eisenhower, Eisenhower is giving his approval to Operation Ajax. Right? That is what is lost in 1953. And that very idealized vision of Iran that Americans have is what is lost in 1979. That is the tragedy. But I think you have to understand that whole history before you start looking for blame and victims and, you know, culprits and so on. So I've talked.